There is a very quiet moment in some people's lives when something begins to change inside. It's not a change that the world notices right away. There is no announcement, there is no explanation, there is no dramatic event that marks the beginning. On the outside, everything looks exactly the same. The person continues to live their routine, talking to the same people, walking the same streets, looking at the same places. But inside her, something began to awaken. An empath almost always recognizes this moment too late to turn back, because he notices a strange thing happening around his own life. Thoughts that once seemed like just thoughts begin to turn into encounters. Quiet ideas begin to turn into events. Deep sensations begin to reflect in the external world, as if reality itself were responding to something that is born within the mind. And it is at this point that many empaths begin to feel a certain discomfort, because it seems impossible. It seems like a coincidence. It seems, perhaps, but when this happens over and over again, something within the soul begins to understand that it may not be just coincidence. It was exactly this phenomenon that deeply caught Carl Jung's attention. He realized that there are times when a person's inner world seems to align in a mysterious way with happenings in the outer world, as if reality is moving in the same direction as what the soul has begun to recognize. Jung called this synchronicity. It is not control. It is not manipulation of reality. It's not a mind trick. It is something much quieter and deeper. It is the moment when the inner world and the outer world begin to talk to each other. And interestingly, this seems to happen most intensely in the lives of people who have gone through long periods of silence, introspection, and emotional pain. Empaths. Rare souls, people who spent much of their lives trying to understand why they felt everything so intensely. Because the truth is that before noticing any kind of synchronicity in life, almost every empath goes through a phase of deep internal isolation, a phase in which it seems that nothing around makes sense, a phase in which thoughts seem heavy, in which the heart seems to carry emotions that do not belong only to itself. But it is exactly within this phase that something begins to happen. A silent transformation, a transformation that few notice while it is happening, because little by little the empath begins to realize that his thoughts are no longer the same, and when thoughts change, the reality around it begins to change as well. Not magically, but in a symbolic way, mysteriously, in such a subtle way that only those who go through this process can recognize it. And this is where something begins that Carl Jung considered one of the most profound phenomena of human experience. The moment when the world ceases to seem like a random place, and it begins to reveal small signs that there is an invisible connection between what is born inside the mind and that which begins to emerge around life. But this does not happen to just anyone, and it almost never happens early in life. This usually appears only after a long interior crossing, after a silent pain, after a profound process of transformation, because before thoughts begin to find an echo in reality, the empath must first cross the end of his old identity. And this crossing changes everything. The moment the empath realizes their thoughts were never just thoughts. There is a very particular moment in the life of an empath when something starts to look different in the way reality is organized around him. At first, he doesn't perceive it clearly. In fact, the first reaction is usually doubt, because for a long time he believed that his thoughts were just something internal, something that happened inside the mind and disappeared soon after, like clouds passing through the sky. But then something starts to happen, small coincidences, small meetings, small events that seem to respond exactly to what was happening inside him, not in an exaggerated way, not dramatically, but in a silent way. So silent that, if he wasn't attentive, he might never notice. A thought arises. A few hours later, something related appears in the external world. A memory arises. Days later, a person linked to this memory reappears unexpectedly. A question is born within the mind, and a short time later, the answer seems to come from somewhere completely unexpected. At first, the empath ignores it. He thinks it's just coincidence. The rational mind tries to explain, try to organize. He tries to reduce it to something ordinary. But when these events start repeating themselves many times, something inside him starts moving. It's not enthusiasm, it's not euphoria. It is something much deeper. A silent feeling that there is an invisible connection between what happens inside the mind and what happens in the world. It was exactly this kind of phenomenon that caught Carl Jung's attention. Jung realized that there are times when certain external events seem to align with internal states of the human psyche, not as cause and effect, but as if both were manifestations of the same invisible movement. He called it synchronicity. But for the empath, this concept does not appear first as a theory. It appears as experience, because at some point in life, the empath begins to realize that his thoughts are not just passing thoughts. They carry something more. They carry meaning. They carry direction. They carry psychic energy. But this perception is not born in a quiet phase of life. Most of the time, it is born after long periods of emotional confusion. After phases in which the empath felt that his mind was a chaotic place, excessive thoughts, intense sensations, perceptions that seemed too difficult to explain. For a long time, he believed that this was just a burden, an oversensitivity, a kind of internal error. But then something changes when he begins to move away from the noise of the world, when he starts to be more silent, when he begins to observe his own mind without trying to fight it. It is at this moment that something curious happens. Thoughts begin to become clearer, more organized, more aware, and along with this internal change, the external reality begins to look different. Coincidences increase. Unexpected encounters become more frequent. The answers appear in unlikely ways, and slowly the empath begins to notice something that almost no one around him does. Reality may not be as random as it seems. Perhaps there is an invisible connection between what the mind recognizes and what the world reveals. But realizing this also brings a different kind of loneliness, because when this realization is born, the empath begins to understand that few people actually live at that level of consciousness. Most people live reacting to the world, but the empath begins to notice something different, that the world also reacts to the internal state of the soul. And this discovery changes the way he sees his own life, because now your thoughts no longer seem unimportant. They start to look like seeds, invisible seeds that in some mysterious way find a reflection in reality. And when this perception matures, the empath begins to go through a process that Jung considered essential for the growth of the psyche. The journey of inner transformation. A journey that begins exactly when the empath realizes that what happens inside the mind, it can echo in the very fabric of reality, and from that moment on, nothing seems completely random anymore. The silent pain that prepares the mind to recognize synchronicity. Almost no one realizes that before a person begins to notice synchronicities in their life, they usually go through a long period of silent pain. Not a dramatic pain, not a pain that draws attention, but a deep and silent pain, a constant feeling of not completely belonging to the world around you. Empaths usually carry this feeling from a very early age. From an early age, they notice things that others seem to ignore. They perceive emotions hidden in people's words. They perceive invisible tensions in the environments. They perceive intentions that no one seems to understand. Early in life, this is often confusing because the empath grows up believing that maybe there is something wrong with him. Maybe he feels too much. Maybe he thinks too much. Maybe he notices things he shouldn't. So for many years, he tries to adapt, try to be simpler. He tries to ignore his own perceptions, try to live as other people do. But something inside him never quite fits, because the mind of an empath was never made to live only on the surface of things. It naturally dives deeper. She observes more. She feels more. And this creates an inevitable phase in the lives of many empaths. A phase of interior isolation. A phase in which they begin to slowly move away from the noise of the world. Not because of rejection, but out of necessity. They need silence. They need internal space. They need time to understand what they feel. And it is exactly within this phase that something begins to reorganize itself within the psyche. Carl Jung described this process as an approximation with the unconscious, an approach to the deepest layers of the mind. When a person begins to look inward honestly, something begins to change. Old patterns begin to fall. Old identities begin to dissolve. And what Jung called the shadow is slowly beginning to be recognized. This is a delicate phase, because at that moment, the empath perceives things within himself that were previously hidden. Fears, old wounds, emotional memories that have never been fully understood. But instead of running away from those parts, something inside him starts doing the opposite. He starts looking. He begins to accept. It begins to integrate. And it is exactly in this process that the mind begins to become deeper, more aware, more connected. When a person integrates forgotten parts of their own psyche, something curious happens. The perception of reality changes. The world begins to look more symbolic, more connected, more full of subtle meanings. And it is at this point that synchronicities begin to emerge more clearly, because the mind is no longer fragmented. It begins to become more whole, more aligned, more aware of yourself. And when the inner world finds this level of integration, the outer world begins to reflect this movement in unexpected ways. Coincidences gain meaning. Encounters seem to happen at the right time. Situations arise as if they were silent answers to questions that were born within the soul. And slowly, the empath begins to realize something that completely changes the way he sees his own existence. Perhaps life has never been just a random sequence of events. Perhaps there has always been an invisible dialogue between the deep mind and the movement of reality. And when this realization finally matures within an empath's soul, a new phase begins. A phase in which he no longer feels just lost within his own sensitivity. Now he begins to realize that his mind is not only sensitive, she is deeply connected to something bigger, something invisible, something that Carl Jung spent much of his life trying to understand. And that a few empaths, they begin to perceive directly through their own experience, when the inner world begins to talk to reality. There is a very specific point in an empath's journey when something changes in the way they perceive their own reality. Before that, life seemed fragmented. The thoughts took place inside the mind. Events arose in the outside world, and both seemed to exist in separate universes. In his mind, he thought. Life happened. No apparent connection. But after going through long periods of inner silence, something begins to reorganize itself within the psyche. Thoughts become clearer. Emotions are no longer just reactions. The mind begins to become a space of deep observation. And it is exactly at this moment that the empath begins to notice something strange happening around him. Certain events seem to arise just as a specific thought matures within him, not as a control, not as a wish being forced, but as if reality were moving in the same direction as an internal movement. Sometimes the empath thinks of someone he hasn't seen in a long time. Days later, that person reappears unexpectedly, At other times, a deep question arises within the mind, and a short time later, an answer appears in a book, in a conversation, or even in an unexpected encounter. At first, this seems like a coincidence, but when these coincidences start happening over and over again, something within consciousness begins to notice a pattern. It was exactly this pattern that Carl Jung tried to understand for many years. He realized that there are times in life when certain external events seem to reflect internal states of the psyche, as if both were connected by something that goes beyond ordinary logic. Jung did not call this reality control. He called it synchronicity, a kind of meaningful link between internal and external events. But the empath does not understand this first as theory. He understands it as experience. Because there comes a time when thoughts no longer seem like just thoughts. They start to look like signs, directions, internal movements that find an echo in the world around them. And when this perception is strengthened, life begins to gain a new depth. Small events start to carry meaning. Encounters no longer seem totally random. Certain moments seem to come just when the soul was ready to meet them. That doesn't mean everything becomes easy. In fact, the opposite often happens, because when the empath begins to perceive this silent dialogue between mind and reality, he also realizes that his thoughts have weight, that your emotions carry direction, that his consciousness influences more things than he imagined. And this brings a new internal responsibility, a silent responsibility, because now he understands that what is born inside the mind is not something neutral. Repeated thoughts shape perceptions, perceptions shape choices, choices shape paths. And slowly the empath begins to understand something that Jung suggested in a very profound way. External reality often reflects the internal state of the psyche, not immediately, not mechanically, but in a symbolic way, as if the world were a subtle mirror of what happens inside the soul. And when this perception matures, something begins to change profoundly in the way the empath lives. He begins to observe his own thoughts more carefully. You begin to notice internal patterns. He begins to feel when something inside him is aligned and when it is not. And little by little, he understands that the true transformation of reality never begins outside. It starts within. Because the outer world often only reveals what has already begun to form in the inner world. And when this awareness fully awakens, the empath begins to go through one of the deepest phases of the inner journey. The phase in which the old identity begins to dissolve. The integration of the shadow and the end of the old identity. Before life begins to reveal deep synchronicities, almost every empath goes through a process that few people around can perceive. A silent process, an internal process. A process that Carl Jung described as the integration of the shadow. For much of their lives, many empaths try to live only with what they believe to be their brightest part. They try to be understanding, kind, careful, gifts for others. But deep in the psyche, there are other parts, parts that were ignored, parts that were hidden, parts that have never been given space to exist, frustrations, old fears, silent anger, sorrows that were never fully expressed. These parts form what Jung called the shadow. And as long as these parts remain unconscious, the mind remains fragmented. One part tries to be light, another part remains hidden in the dark. But there comes a time when the tie can no longer maintain that division. Something inside him begins to call for honesty, a deep honesty with oneself. Then he starts looking inside. He begins to perceive emotions that he previously avoided. He begins to recognize wounds that were never fully understood. This process is not comfortable. In fact, it is often the loneliest period of the journey, because at that moment the empath realizes that much of the identity he has built throughout his life was not completely true. It was an adaptation, a way to survive emotionally, but it was not the essence. And slowly, this old identity begins to fall. Old beliefs begin to fade. Old papers no longer make sense. The need to please begins to lose strength. The need to explain who he is to the world begins to fade. And when this happens, something deep reorganizes itself within the psyche. The mind ceases to struggle against parts of itself. It begins to become whole. Shadows are no longer enemies. They become recognized parts of consciousness itself. And when this integration starts to happen, something curious arises. The perception of reality changes again. The world starts to seem more symbolic. Certain events seem to arise just when the psyche has finished integrating a new part of itself, as if reality were accompanying the inner transformation. That is why Jung said that the journey of self-knowledge does not only transform the mind, it transforms the way reality is perceived. And when an empath goes through this process deeply, something very important happens. The old identity dies, not dramatically, but in a silent way. The person he believed himself to be, it simply ceases to exist. And in place of this old identity comes something new, something more whole, something more conscious, something more aligned with what has always existed within the soul, but which never had space to appear. It is at this point that many empaths perceive something profoundly liberating. They no longer have to try to be who the world expects, because now they begin to feel that they are becoming what they really are. And curiously, it is exactly at this moment that synchronicities begin to appear even more clearly. As if life were recognizing this new phase of consciousness, as if the world is responding to the silent transformation that has taken place within the soul. And from here, the journey enters its deepest phase. The phase in which the empath begins to trust in the invisible movement of life itself. The empath who learns to trust in the invisible movement of life. There is a very quiet point in an empath's journey when something begins to become deeply clear. It is not intellectual clarity. It is not a logical explanation of life. It's an internal sensation. A sense that something inside him has finally found a kind of balance that once seemed impossible. For a long time, the empath lived trying to understand the world, trying to understand why certain situations happened, trying to find out the reason for certain pains, trying to interpret emotions that often didn't even belong to him. The mind worked non-stop. Thoughts arose in sequence. Questions came up constantly. It was as if consciousness was always trying to find an answer to something that never seemed entirely clear. But after going through the deepest phase of inner transformation, something begins to change. The need to understand everything begins to fade. The urgency to control the course of life begins to lose strength. And slowly, something new emerges within the soul. A quiet confidence. Not a trust based on external certainties, but a trust based on one's own inner experience. Because now the empath has seen something that once seemed impossible. He saw that, at many moments in his life, important events arose just when something inside him was ready to receive them. He realized that certain answers appeared at the exact moment a question matured within his mind. He realized that certain encounters happened when his consciousness was prepared to recognize them, and little by little, this perception begins to transform the way he walks through life. Now he no longer lives just reacting to events. He begins to observe the flow of reality more calmly. You start to notice when something seems aligned. You begin to notice when something just doesn't belong in your way anymore. And this sensitivity is not born of fear, it is born of consciousness, because the empath realizes something that few people do. Life has a movement of its own. an invisible movement, a movement that often tries to lead the person to what really belongs to their inner destiny. But to recognize this movement, something needs to happen first. The mind needs to slow down. The heart needs to stop fighting everything. The soul needs to accept that not everything needs to be controlled. And when that state starts to emerge, life starts to look different. Events no longer seem totally random. Small coincidences begin to reveal themselves as signs. Certain doors close just when they no longer belong to the journey. Certain paths arise when consciousness is ready to follow them. And little by little, the empath begins to walk with a new posture towards existence. He no longer needs to force directions. He no longer needs to run after everything. He learns something much deeper. He learns to observe, to feel, to recognize when life is trying to show something. Carl Jung believed that when a person begins to live in greater harmony with their own psyche, reality begins to respond in unexpected ways. Not because the person controls the world, but because she starts to live in line with what really belongs to her essence. And when that happens, life begins to reveal a different kind of order, a silent order, a symbolic order, an order that cannot be forced, only recognized. It is at this moment that the empath begins to feel something that for a long time seemed distant, inner peace, not the peace of the absence of challenges, but the peace of knowing that your own consciousness now walks in harmony with that which truly is. And that feeling changes everything, because now he begins to realize something even deeper, something that Carl Jung has repeatedly observed when studying the journey of the human soul. When the mind and destiny begin to move in the same direction, reality reorganizes itself in surprising ways. When thoughts and destiny start moving in the same direction, there is a stage in an empath's inner journey that few people get to experience, not because it is impossible, but because it requires something very rare: courage to go through one's own transformation, courage to leave behind old versions of yourself, courage to accept that life may be leading the soul to something completely different from what it imagined at the beginning. When an empath reaches this point, something inside him no longer fights against his own sensitivity. For many years he believed that feeling too much was a problem, that thinking deeply was a burden, that noticing so many things was something that made her life more difficult. But now the perspective has completely changed. He begins to realize that everything that seemed like a burden, it was actually part of your awakening process. Because this sensitivity was exactly what allowed him to go through the journey of self-knowledge. It was this deep realization that allowed him to recognize his own shadows. It was this intense awareness that allowed him to become someone more whole. And now, looking back, something begins to unfold with astonishing clarity. Many of the events that seemed confusing in the past were quietly paving the way for the person he became. Situations that seemed like losses opened space for new directions. Moments of solitude allowed him to find himself. Phases of doubt created questions that led to profound discoveries. And little by little, the empath begins to realize that his own life seems to have followed a kind of invisible order, not a rigid order, but a symbolic sequence of transformations. Carl Jung believed that when a person approaches what he called individuation, life begins to reveal significant patterns. Events that once seemed isolated begin to form a story. Coincidences begin to become messages. Unexpected moments come to carry deep meaning. And at this stage of the journey, something very special happens. Thoughts are no longer just reactions to the world. They begin to reflect a consciousness that is more aligned with their own essence. The mind ceases to be in constant conflict. It becomes quieter, more observant, more present. And when this state arises, the empath begins to perceive something profoundly liberating. He no longer needs to prove anything to the world. It does not need to explain its transformation. You don't need to convince anyone about what you have experienced, because what happened inside his soul is something that only he can understand. And curiously, it is exactly at this moment that the empath begins to feel something that for a long time seemed distant. Love for yourself. Not a love based on pride, but a love based on recognition. Recognition of everything he went through. Recognition of everything he overcame. Recognition of the silent journey that shaped his consciousness. And when that feeling arises, something extraordinary happens. The mind becomes a place of peace. Thoughts cease to be a battlefield. They become a natural expression of consciousness itself. And in that state, something starts happening around life. Synchronicities keep emerging. Meetings continue to happen. Paths continue to reveal themselves. But now the empath no longer tries to decipher every detail. He simply observes. He recognizes it. He accepts. Because now he understands something that Carl Jung realized throughout his entire life of studying the human soul. When a person finally becomes what they were born to be, life begins to respond in ways that previously seemed impossible to explain. And at that moment, the empath discovers something that completely changes his relationship with his own existence. His thoughts were never just thoughts. They have always been part of an invisible conversation between your soul and the very movement of life.